Fred, is the high faith expressed in this epic poem?
Well, that's part of the strand of my life. I consider myself a member of the Reformed Baha'i faith. There are really many denominations of Baha'i, and I have a long and complex spiritual past sort of there too. Beyond that, and I've studied all the religions. I've taught religions. I had academic education in the Bible, biblical studies, old and new, and so forth, and everything else. So it's at a point. It's like, well, what are you? Well, I'm human. I believe everything. And that's why I feel so comfortable. And I mentioned Elaine Morris. I talked to her about, well, is there room? There's people who are atheists, there are people who are Buddhists, there are people who, and is there room for me? Because I'm sort of this too. But I'm sort of like modern too, and beyond all those. To me, I think of it all that fighting stuff over who's got the exclusive truth. To me, and I try to work with that in the poem. That exclusivism, the exclusive truth of the past, those are so much the problem for our human experience. And to my mind, when we look at the global religious experience, we, as many scholars and other thoughtful people, students have said, in the Western world you get all those animosities about exclusivism. Judeo-Christian and Islamic are all grounded in that thinking that there's only one truth. And you got to convert or kill other people into accepting it. Where in all of the Eastern religions, China comes to mind. China had, by the Neo-Confucian period, it had what came to be called the Great Church, a blending of Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism, and people all thought they were the same. I mean, the Chinese would say, and some probably still say today, I belong to the Great Church. And it's not like one or other. And India is the same way. It's very much Sanatana Dharma, the universal sort of Dharma of life. And you're not, Hinduism is a word given to Indian religious experience by the British and Westerners and the Muslims. It really originated with the Muslims when they first invaded in like 15 or 13, 1200, whenever it was. And is the first origin of the word of Hinduism, and then the British picked it up. But to the Indians, historically, they never thought of themselves as having one thing. And there's never been an overarching kind of, Catholicism or the caliphate of Islam, where there's one power, truth, and control.
Yeah, there might have been briefly in Andalusia, the Moorish culture in which it was believed that Jews, Christians, and Muslims are basically the same because they are people of the book, as they referred to.
Yeah.
But that didn't last long. After a few hundred years, it collapsed.
And they were still, at times, they were still endemic. They had to pay a poll tax to the Islamic.
Right, yes. If you were Muslim, you didn't have to pay the tax. So they got a lot of converts.
Yeah. Are you able to detect the effect of these different ways of looking at religion? The Eastern, blending of, accepting of different ways of looking at religion versus the Western, the one true way. In the effect of that on the way people live, or how they relate to each other.
It's modern history. It's all our human history. We know it. It's been all that trauma over trying, I feel, to grow and evolve beyond it. And we, as Jewish writer Saul Bellows said in the early 60s, we're being mixed and poured together. That was back in the 60s, even more so now. I mean, people from everywhere on earth live here and elsewhere. So many sites around. The old isolated cultures they're all gone. They're not the same isolated cultures there used to be 200 years ago or whatever. We're moving globally to a more human consciousness. And I think the internet even reflects that more. Now, yes, there are all the negative forces working to destroy us. You know, I've had a long, long interest in the United Nations going all the way back to high school too, and been really involved with a lot. And there's a period of my life where I read over 100 books on the United Nations and the League of Nations, so I know that history well too. And I'm not naive and Pollyanna about any of that, you know. But what else do we have? Either we can kill ourselves, kill one another. It almost seems that's what we're going to do. And there isn't a simple answer because we're human. And so, you know, as a poet, what can I do? Let's go out to the moon and get another perspective on it. Look at it this way. What did the ancient poets and the shamans do? They told a story and touch hearts and minds, and that's my hope. That's important.
But if I could, is there practical wisdom that comes out of, let's say, the Eastern way of thinking that we haven't quite grasped
Well,
ourselves?
here's the thing that I try to bring in my epic too in terms of Eastern religious experience. It's gone through modernism as well, all right? It's gone through all the problems of modernism. Communism, Marxism destroyed the religion, all of the three strands of the great church in China. The Cultural Revolution, they went out and destroyed 20,000 or more churches, temples and churches and everything else. And it was officially atheist. It attempted to tear it out of the Chinese consciousness. And depending upon who you want to read, it achieved that to various levels, where the majority, like 89, 90% and more, will say that they are atheists. So all of those ideas of what the mystic East was are no longer true. I lived in Japan for a year and a half, and I knew Japan on a personal level. Many Japanese, every walk of life, and Japan history has all gone through that modern experience too. I've read, I taught non-Western literature for years and studied in college and elsewhere. And in China, Japan, South Asian literature, the story of that literature is like the West, the loss of belief in the old ways. And we take it for granted, if to whatever extent we've read literature, American and English literature, that's the story. It's this great myth of secularization. But where are we with it? And so I feel we're moving towards a new vision. I mean, as a poet, I'm trying to help create. I don't have delusions of grandeur that I myself alone create this vision. What I believe all epic poets do is they sense what the vision is in life at that time and is moving to what is the dominant vision, and dominant not necessarily in a negative way. I mean one that is, it's there under the surface or growing or is pervasive, and try to serve it. And I think I would oppose all that kind of thinking that it isn't trying to control people, isn't engineering, it's not social engineering, to all the political or religious attempts to do that. We're going to force people into this way. The whole revolution under Lenin and everybody else was about forcing people to be equal. And so forth, and you know, it ravaged those societies. They still aren't over it, and we've had our own problems in the West. I think, as many writers and thinkers have thought of it as well. But often, we have a tendency. We want to go to the culture wars. How does this serve and fit in? I mean, we've become really divided, extremely fragmented civilization and culture. more than we ourselves, I think, even understand and realize sometimes how fragmented we are. And we can't reach agreement on things that then enable us to deal with our problems. And one thing I feel is we need a more global, universal vision of life. Doesn't mean we all become the same. We're not all become mush and sentimentality, but we have a sense we're all human, and we need to do what's in our best interest. We have these immense problems, and nobody can agree on how to solve them, and they keep getting worse and worse. And it may seem unlikely that a poet can help, but I'm trying not to be part of the problem, I hope.
Frederick, I'm really curious about the format of the story. As I was listening to you read it, I could picture it in paragraph format, or in a more of a, what might be considered a form of a poem. Is it mostly a matter of your choice that it's written in a poem format, or is there something about the type of story it is or the way you tell it that lends itself to be considered a poem versus
It's a really good
story
question.
of any kind?
Really good question. Even fascinating to me, to think about, because I think it just provokes a lot of good thoughts in me. I think, yes, it's a form, it's in poetry because it reaches deeper into the human psyche than prose. Prose doesn't work. Prose, we get into the culture wars, we get into all of that argumentation. What epic poetry does is it tries to lift it higher, to a different level. Often said epic poetry in terms of tone and approach strives for grandeur and elevation and perspective on it. So yeah, it just falls into, it has to be in verse. And that verse, for English language, all narrative storytelling tends to be iambic pentameter, also called blank verse, about 10 syllables a line, and so on. And it's just more dramatic. And inevitably, it lifts it, Shakespeare will have plays where there's lots of prose going on, and then when the really intense moments come on, he's got to fall into verse to really convey it. I hope. Is that kind of what you're thinking? And it is paragraphs, verse paragraphs, okay? And that's a form that's thought of too. John Milton's often thought of as writing in verse paragraphs. Whole ideas or actions taking place in this paragraph. And, I've studied all that. I know I'm doing that too. I consciously did it because you have to divide meaning and action into intelligible wholes, or you overwhelm people. You got to give them a break once in a while for the rest of the reader too, and whatever. So. Okay.
Speaking of poetry and prose, I refresh my memory. Homer did not actually write the stories. Didn't he tell them, or am I getting that?
Well, it was all oral. They weren't written.
Okay.
They were oral for many years, maybe a couple hundred years before they were finally written down. Nobody really knows for sure when Homer lived. People argue, was there a Homer? There was a bunch of Homers, and it was all put together.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
personally, I believe there was a Homer, because there's such a cohesive consciousness there telling the story.
Mm-hmm.
And no corporate body of people putting it together are going to have that. That mind had the grasp of all those details and worked them and knew what was in his head. And a bunch of people wouldn't do it. They'd make mistakes here and there. And they don't exist in that poem, those poems. So I agree with people who say that about Homer. But you're quite right, it's oral. And really, all epic poetry is trying to do that. It's really about a storytelling and reciting it orally. And I hope I'm able to do that to some extent. That's enjoyable. I haven't bored you too much.
Well, no, I'm thinking about, storytelling, and it's, using poetry lends itself, I think, to more dramatic presentation of the idea, around the campfire. Trying to think of the troubadour, the bards,
exactly
who conveyed these grand ideas in a rhythmic kind of descriptive way. And so I think that's what Homer is about, actually.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Very
Interesting. Was that in the very beginning? I get the book and read again, but was it Don Quixote that?
Don Quixote becomes basically the MC of sorts, master of ceremonies on the moon.
Okay.
And if you've ever read Don Quixote himself is reading books about knight errantry, and falls asleep in his study and wakes up Don Quixote. He's really Alonso Quijano. Alonso Quijano is the man who becomes Don Quixote in the book. He falls asleep reading in his study and becomes this character. So I'm playing with that myth too, repeatedly throughout the poem, that the persona himself has fallen asleep over Don Quixote, and Don Quixote's on the moon.
I just got confused because then they brought in Miguel Cervantes.
Yeah.
And I thought,
well,
really
I play with those names loosely, and is Dante the man, the Dante in the book? Is Cervantes, the writer, the Don Quixote in the book? So I'm playing with all that appearance and reality. What is real? It's taking place in a dream. Life can seem like a dream.
But Fred, isn't there a real person behind the persona? We're all waiting to hear who that is.
You've got to read the book and
Oh,
yourself.
I think I know. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.